Okay, so we begin in silence, and I'll tell you why. It's a way to bring to mind that we abide safely and securely in the heart of sacred mystery, and that our faith, that this unnameable mystery seeks to find expression through who we are and how we live. So that's why we do this. So if it helps to close your eyes, just to be here. And may grace be in our heads and in our thinking. May grace be in our eyes and in our seeing. May grace be in our ears and in our hearing. May grace be in my mouth and in my speaking. May grace be in our hearts and in our understanding. And may grace be at our ends and at our departing. And may we come to know who we truly are. And may all creation benefit because of what we do here today. May we grow in patience, tolerance, kindness, and love. Amen. And no matter who you are, no matter where you are in your spiritual journey, you are celebrated here. So I have recently spoken to you in here about the influence that Harry Emerson Fosdick has had on me. Several of you have told me that you have bought the now very out-of-date How to Be a Real Person book. It's out of print. You have to get it on Etsy or eBay or through a secondhand dealer. After I read that book, I read several other books by Fosdick because I thought that any preacher that the New York Times sent to hear him preach so that they could report about his sermon in the paper the next day was worth paying attention to. So Fosdick actually wrote some things about preaching. He said that a good sermon ought to have the marks of a good conversation, like a conversation you would have in your living room after dinner with friends. By the way, I want to say what I offer in here are not sermons. Sermons are things most people want to get away from. You know, when you have a fight with your partner, don't you preach to me? That sort of thing. Sermons have gotten a bad reputation. Sermons are set in a liturgical context, and lectures or teachings are not. So we're not in a liturgical context. So Fosdick also said, find out what makes people cry in their pillows at night and speak to that. One of the things that he most stressed was that what he called a good sermon should be relevant. And one of the things that he wrote, he said, nobody drives all the way across town to hear the latest thing that happened to the Jebusites. Now, the Jebusites were descendants of one of Noah's sons, Ham. They lived in tribes around Jerusalem. And were conquered by David when he became king, just in case you're curious about the Jebusites. I do know about the Jebusites, so I know we'll talk about them. One of the things that really appealed to me about Fosdick's work was that he stressed putting together, now you got to remember, he wrote in 1900, 1910, in that range. So before all the things that we know now, Fosdick was writing very insightful stuff. And he said that he was trying to put together insights from psychology and religious spiritual teachings, and that really appealed to me because that's what I saw myself wanting to do with my own life. I was a junior in the university when I first encountered Fosdick on being a real person. I read a lot of his books, still own them. It was in seminary that I got introduced to other works by German theologians. Fosdick was influenced by this man, David Friedrich Strauss. And it is at this point in this teaching that I'm going to do a huge parenthesis. The parenthesis consists of two parts. The first is going to be about theology and religion, and the second is going to be about education. And actually, they are about failures in both of these arenas. So let's talk about theology and religion. Some people are describing that what's going on in American culture right now is a culture war. And they describe this culture war as a religious war. And I think that this conflict is due primarily, in my opinion, to two things. First, the failure of Christianity in the United States to teach the laity who attend churches what has been going on in biblical and theological studies since the time of this man, David Strauss. He is the person who pioneered what we now call the third, or actually the second quest for the historical Jesus, was started by this German theologian, biblical scholar. Now, you will recall what I said a couple of weeks ago, that there was a battle that went on in the early 1900s between a group that became the fundamentalist and a group that became the modernist. And the battle was about the things that this man was teaching. So in the United States, that battle was won by the progressives in the universities and urban areas, mostly in the Northeast. Okay? With the exception of institutions of higher learning in the South. The South got all the fundamentalists. This is important to know because most of us were raised in the South. When I was in seminary, I was given an education that was up to date on what was going on in the world of theology, particularly theology coming out of Europe, mostly Germany. The context at that time for all the advances that were made in all the major disciplines, science, math, physics, medicine, psychology, theology, archaeology, they were all coming from Germany. And we were taught in seminary two things. First, it was important to know this material. And second, we would have difficulty teaching or preaching about it in the churches where we were appointed. So I was required to read this guy. I couldn't. I learned enough German to get in a doctoral program, but I couldn't read him. I read his interpreters, but I did read a few other people: Paul Tillich, Rudolf Bultmann, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Reinhold Niebuhr, Richard Niebuhr, Emil Brunner, Helmut Thielicke, Friedrich Schleiermacher, Martin Niemöller, Soren Kierkegaard. You impressed? Okay. Now here's a question. Why couldn't we talk about what we were learning in our churches? Because several generations of people had already embraced the tenets of fundamentalism. They had been taught these tenets by people that they loved and trusted. So when somebody came in and stood, especially in the pulpit, to say what you have been taught all these years is not correct, there's another way to look at things, doors slammed and people got fired. Now, as I said also a couple of weeks ago, this is very important. with the exception of some parachurch organizations, like the Center for Action and Contemplation, or maybe like this class, and some other denominations. The Christian education program in every Christian church in the United States, Catholic and Protestant, has been influenced by this conflict, and it has gone to the conservative side, even in this church. If we have published curriculum that comes from the United Methodist Church, it's to the right. Okay. In this way, the church has failed its constituents, and it has shot itself in the foot because it hamstrings preachers from preaching what is the truth. Now, the second part of this parenthetical statement is about education, and there will be more about this a smidgen later in what I want to talk about today, when I start talking about where do people get their news. I was sitting with the senior pastor of another church in this city this week. He's open-minded, progressive stance, and his church is located in a sea of MAGA supporters. He's got a tough job. And he was saying that one of the major factors contributing to our cultural war was ignorance. Now, I thought I knew what he meant, but I asked him to elaborate on that, and he said, well, you know that half of the adult population in the United States is functionally illiterate. Now, I did not know that, and I don't believe that. He said, I'll send you the statistics. So he sent me a link to the National Literacy Institute. You can go to their website and check this out for yourself. An adult in their analysis is anybody above the age of 18. Are you sitting down? The United States ranks 36th in literacy of all the nations in the world. "24% of the adult population in the United States cannot read. It gets worse. 54%, that's over half of the adult population in the United States of America, has a literacy rate below 6th grade level. That means these people read like a 12-year-old child. Now keep these stunning statistics in mind when we get to a later part of this teaching. Because when the teacher or preacher wants to go to the sources of what is actually factually going on in the world of theology or any other thing, what is mostly the response is, that's causing me to give up something I already believe. And it's hard. So a German theologian, actually he was Swiss but claimed German heritage, and he was in that group of theologians that I mentioned a minute ago. He was responsible for introducing a whole new generation, myself included, to what he called the strange new world in the Bible. The Bible was not a book of science, he said, and it was never written either to be taken literally or with us in mind. Now, there's an American scholar who would build on this guy's work, as well as that of Strauss. He came to be regarded as one of the authorities on both introducing people to what the Bible really says and who Jesus really was Marcus Borg. Now, I know I recommend a lot of books, but these two ought to be in your library. They're readable, they're accessible. reading the Bible again for the first time, and Jesus. Borg's book on the Bible is subtitled Taking the Bible Seriously, but Not Literally. So the guy who did this was a man named Karl Barth, a German theologian. And he said something that I have attempted to do in my teaching ever since. And that was, he said that the preacher who was doing his job well should preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. Now, if you have been following me so far today, you can see that doing this, we already have a couple of problems. Because of what people have been taught to believe about the Bible and because of where they get their news. People who call themselves Christian, whether Christian nationalists or just to the right of center, take the Bible literally. And to teach otherwise can stir up stuff. I've been there, experienced that. And second, what we consider our source of news is something that Karl Barth could not have ever considered. There was no internet. There was none of that, social media, in Barth's time. So if the preacher today attempts to speak truth about the Bible as well as about Jesus, there's trouble ahead. And where do we get reliable information about what is really going on in the world, especially the 54% of adults in this country who do not read above a 6th grade level? They don't read The Economist. They don't read the Financial Times. They do not read The Atlantic. They get their information from TikTok. And what we know about these sources like TikTok and other social media is of their incredible ability to influence. Now, I'm sure some of you have heard that right after the election, there were black students in high schools and in historically black universities who were targeted on text with racist messages. You heard that. I don't know where that nonsense came from. I think they figured some of that out. What's amazing to me about that is that we have a technology that knows your skin color. Knows your skin color. I'm not talking about somebody else's, knows yours and mine. Because of our online lives with Amazon and Facebook and other things, every bit of data that can be, has been, and will be mined about you to influence what you see on the internet. It's unavoidable. So if the preacher were to follow Barth's advice, have a newspaper in one hand, the Bible in the other, which newspaper? What's the source of information? Barth believed that Christians should be relevant to the real world and that their preaching should be both culturally relevant and aligned with the truth of Scripture. He also believed that neither the Bible nor the newspaper should exist without the other, and that the world should be seen through the lens of faith. So in the preview that I sent out about today, I don't know if you read that or not, I mentioned a talk that I heard Dr. Jim Bankston give a number of years ago when the debate about full inclusion, this is about the gay lesbian issue, was just getting ramped up in the United Methodist Church. And in that talk, Dr. Bankston said something that has been indelibly etched in my heart and mind ever since. He said the church has lost its ability to be prophetic. It remains to be seen whether the church can remain relevant. So, all of that being said, I want to attempt to be relevant and prophetic about a time when all hell broke loose in the early Jesus movement, and to see how that might fit us. There's a story in the various narratives we have of Jesus, at least in our Christian collection. There are many other scriptures that didn't make it into the Christian collection. And that story is very familiar to anybody, even if they never have been to church. It's the feeding of the multitude. Jesus took 5 loaves and 2 fishes and fed either 4,000 or 5,000 people, depending on which one you look. Those are not literal, you know that. Now, that story was so important to the early Christian movement that it's repeated 6 times in the narratives. That's a clue that something is important. And as I said, this material was never written with us in mind. It was never written into verses that are numbered or chapters that are numbered. The story was to be taken as a whole. And the whole, they had more time than we do. You know, give it to me now, people. So the story was to be taken with the story that came after it. And that is the story about Jesus walking on water. I referred to this story in one version a couple of weeks ago. So I want to read it to you the way Eugene Peterson renders it. In the evening, his disciples went down to the sea, got in the boat. You know, boats are big symbols, ships and seas, and headed back across. They're going back. They're going back across the water to Capernaum. It had grown quite dark. And Jesus had not yet returned. They felt alone and abandoned. A huge wind blew up. Holy Spirit, whatever, creation, churning the sea. There's darkness, wind, all that stuff are such great metaphors. They were maybe 3 or 4 miles out when they saw Jesus walking on the sea quite near the boat. They were scared senseless, but he reassured them, "It's me, it's all right, don't be afraid." So they took him on board, and in no time they reached land, the exact spot where they were headed. The next day, the crowd that was left behind realized that there had only been one boat and that Jesus had not gotten into it with his disciples. They'd also seen them go off without him. Now, boats from Tiberias had pulled up near where they had eaten the bread blessed by the master. So when the crowd realized that he was gone and wasn't coming back, they piled into the Tiberias boats and headed for Capernaum looking for Jesus. When they found him back across the sea, they said, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" And Jesus answered, "You've come looking for me not because you saw God in my actions, but because I fed you, filled your stomachs, and for free." It's a great story. Now, fundamentalists take this along with all the other miracle stories, and if the Bible says Jesus walked on water, by God, Jesus walked on water. They believe in the literal nature of the miracles. Now, there are some to the right of center who don't believe that Jesus actually walked on water, but they still take the story literally by saying, no, he walked near the edge of the water. The disciples only thought he was walking on water, so that's why they wrote it up the way they did. Both of those interpretations miss the point of the power of this very incredible story. So like the parable of the Good Samaritan and like the parable of the prodigal son, this story is a parable. It's not a description of something that literally happened. It's a parable told by the early church. And one of the reasons the religious literacy is so important, and this is again just an example of how the church has failed at good religious education, is knowing that these miracles that are told about Jesus all come from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Scriptures, every one of them. Now, why is that? I'm going to do a little religious teaching here, biblical teaching. The writers, especially Matthew and especially Luke and then Paul, wanted to show that Jesus was the new Moses. This is especially true of the Gospel of John. Jesus was going to be the new Moses who would lead the Jesus followers out of the captivity as they saw it, that held them in the Jewish tradition, and bring them to a new world. Okay? That's the Exodus story for the Jesus followers. So if you go read the Hebrew Scriptures, they're full of miracles. In the Exodus story, Moses parts the sea so that the fleeing Israelites can get across to dry land, and then when the Egyptians get in there, the sea closes and drowns them all. Not a very loving picture of God, but to this day, people are frightened of God because of stories like this. Or they pick sides. God saves us but kills our enemies. There are a lot of water stories told about Jesus. We're going to get to some of them. So in the desert, people had no food. So God rained down food for people in the desert to feed them. When there was a shortage of water, Moses hit a rock and water came forth. Jesus fed a multitude with meager food supply. He turned water into wine. When Moses died, he was succeeded by Joshua. And one of the storytelling traditions in Jewish tradition is to wrap the identity of a leader around that leader's successor. So when Joshua became the new leader, he got some of Moses' power. So much so that Joshua commanded the sun to stop moving in the sky. You believe that? And the reason that Joshua did this was so that the Israelites would have more daylight to kill the Amorites. Another example of God taking sides. Now, if you have attended church much at all, you've likely heard the phrase, the law and the prophets. Jesus said, I came to fulfill the law and the prophets, the law and the prophets. It's very big in Jewish thought. Jesus was a Jew. Just remind you. So the two most primary prophets in the Jewish tradition were Elijah and Elisha. And they both did miracles. They could part water. Elisha could take his cloak and boop, the water would split and he could walk across. They could waft up into the sky on chariots. Nothing stood in their way. They even had the power to raise the dead. So when stories are told about Jesus performing miracles, every single one of them is a replica of something taken from Hebrew Scripture. Now keep that in mind. When you think about, well, we have the New Testament reporting what Jesus did. The New Testament is telling stories about the new leader that Jesus was to be. The important thing to discern, just as is any true with any parable told by Jesus, is what did these stories mean to the people who first heard them? Again, they weren't written for us. What might they mean for us, these stories? When I first started teaching this material right after 9/11, I got said about me, he doesn't believe in miracles. And I got asked to me, do you believe in miracles? And the answer is yes, I do. Yes, I do. This is a miracle, what we're doing right here. That I can vibrate 2 pieces of flesh in my throat and disturb the sound waves in such a way that they strike your ear in such a way that you can take those sound waves and translate them into symbols and images that you think you understand what I'm saying. There are as many different understandings of what I'm saying as there are people in a room. That's a miracle. I believe the shift in perception that allows us just to have a smidgen of non-duality is a miracle. The very act of committing to peace, love, joy, and patience is a miracle. The transformation of a negative emotion into a positive emotion is a miracle. The ability to be present is a superpower. Now, I know I'm repeating myself, but it cannot be said too much. These stories, both the stories told by Jesus and the stories told about Jesus, were not told or written down with us in mind. Nothing in the Christian collection was. Now this is hard because it was hard for me. I grew up being taught that the Bible was written for Southern Baptists who lived in Tennessee in 1940. It had no wider application. And if you didn't interpret it like we did, you were sure going to hell. That's what I was taught by people I loved and trusted. And they were teaching the best that they knew at the time that they knew it. Now, though much of what we have was written to tell the story of Jesus to who were not familiar with the Jesus of history, this applies to the teachings in the Gospel of Thomas. It applies mostly to Mark. Some of the letters written by Paul, all of which were written way before the Gospels were written. They were written to acquaint people with Jesus. Then you have other writings in the Christian collection, particularly John, that were written because at the time they were written, the Jesus movement was in extreme turmoil. There were some who wanted to go back to Judaism. Do you see that fight in the writings of Paul? There's some who wanted to strike out for something new. They didn't know what. And so there was this conflict. Some were saying Jesus is the new Moses, and he can lead us out of this bondage we have been in to a new land. And they were being invited to leave behind what they had and to embrace something entirely new. Now keep this in mind as we try to be relevant to our circumstances. In the passage that we're considering today, the disciples pull back. They got scared. They didn't have anything to go on. They had no traditions yet. They did where they came from. So in the Jesus narrative, you will find over and over and over and over again Jesus crossing over to the other side, crossing boundaries of all kinds, crossing the sea, crossing the Jordan, crossing over to the other side. Every boundary, every barrier. And sometimes people got scared and they went back. And that's what the story is about. Some of the disciples went back. They wanted the religious security that they had. They didn't want the anxiety of walking into a new place, as well as a new understanding of God. So they left Jesus. And they got in their boats and they headed across the sea of Capernaum. It was dark. Darkness is always a metaphor for being apart from the sacred. And here it's a metaphor for being separated from Jesus. The disciples were alone on the sea. The waves were rising. A strong wind was blowing. Rowing became impossible, and they were terrified. And this is when they saw Jesus walking on the water toward them. And that terrified them even more. Now, though the story, and I checked this out in a number of translations, has Jesus saying some version of, be not afraid. That's not what the text actually says. What the text actually says when they say to Jesus, who are you? What is going on? And the response is, I am. Now, if you're familiar with the Jewish Exodus story, it starts with this guy standing by a burning bush saying, what in the world is going on here? And he hears a voice coming from the bush when he says, who are you? And the voice says, I am. So on the turbulent sea, when the disciples say, who is this manifestation of the sacred? They hear back this ancient Jewish affirmation, I am. You know, in the Gospel of John, you have all these I am statements. I'm the bread of life. I'm the water. I'm the vine. I'm the door. I'm this. And all of them are riffs on that story of Moses and the burning bush. Every one of them. So here's an example of what Karl Barth meant when he talked about the strange new world in the Bible. When people would see the interpretations that Barth and the other scholars were putting on sacred scripture, and they went, wow, this opens up doors of understanding I didn't know existed. So Barth said what Jesus is saying is, I am the life of God calling you into something new, something frightening and dangerous. I'm the love of God calling you to get beyond your defensive barriers, your security walls, into a new understanding of what it means to be human. Receive me from the water into your boat. Now here's the thing. Here's the thing. To hear the truth in the story that I have just related from Christian tradition, if you hear it correctly, there are two things that will happen. Number one, the story is very hopeful. Somebody said, before today's class, would I give a word of hope? It is hopeful. There is something about this new door open to the sacred that is fascinating. It is alluring. It is seductive. Being pulled forward, being invited. It's just wonderful. And at the same time, it is so terrifying. And by that, I don't mean so much it is frightening. It's just awesome. I've tried to think of a metaphor to encapsulate this. And I have thought of one. It's pretty racy. But if hopeful and terrifying is a puzzle to you, think about your first sexual awakenings. Exciting, plotting, planning, conniving, and then, oh my God, what have I got myself into? Now this is paradoxical, and if you don't have both, I'll question whether you got it. It's both. This is what it means to be in the sacred stream and for the sacred stream to flow through us. I think this is what Carl Jung meant when he said, the resolution of our difficulty resides in finding a religious, spiritual solution to life's dilemma. This is it. So, we are at sea. By the way, that phrase did not come from this story. That phrase came from the time when ships navigated the ocean's waters without any modern navigational tools whatsoever. The stars, the wind, intuition. In one of the theological journals I take, a philosopher, James K.A. Smith, who is an immigrant to this country, by the way, he immigrated to America from Canada. Now we have people trying to immigrate from here to there. He teaches at Calvin University, and he wrote these words. As a philosopher and a Christian, it is particularly disconcerting to me how many Christians seem to be suspicious of liberal democracy. And conversely, it is unsettling how many fellow citizens imagine that Christianity is an inherent threat to democracy, though sadly, I can imagine why they have reached that conclusion. I am not a political animal. I have said frequently I wouldn't last 15 minutes as senior pastor of a church because I'm not a political animal. I don't want to know how to work the system. So I really don't know that I'm a trustworthy person to say how we've gotten to this cultural divide that we have in our country. Right, left, political, liberal, red, blue. You know as well as I do that it's grown in some cases to be violent. People have gotten hurt. January 6th is an example. And I do know that we have gotten to a place where some have referred to as sane washing. Have you heard that phrase? Sane washing, where things that would not have been allowed to exist 10 years ago are, no big deal. It's okay. It's understandable. That's a shift. That's a shift. I don't know where you get your news. I've unplugged from most. Commercial news sources are designed to sell me something more than inform me. And there are people on both sides of this divide who seem so sure that they know the answer to things. They know what went wrong, what the Democrats need to get right next time, what we didn't hear, this is how to fix it, all that. This is what you need to fear, this is what you need to hope for. Now, if the biblical teaching that I have done so far today offends some, and it does, I'm so grateful for this place to get to do this teaching, because you know in your heart of hearts there are 98% of the churches in this country where I could not say what I've taught today about the Bible. When you can't teach the Bible in a Christian church, there's something wrong with that picture. You can imagine the risk some preacher might take if he, in alignment not with a political party, but hopefully in alignment with the teachings of Jesus, in an effort to hold the newspaper in one hand and the Bible in the other, critiques our current situation. I honestly believe, though these were not the issues at the time of Jesus, just as homosexuality was not, I am safely within the bounds of the teaching of Jesus when I say that Christian nationalism is not only dangerous, it's just outright wrong. It is the first step in authoritarianism, and it leads to worse. This is why I was so stunned to pick up the newspaper that was delivered to my home on Wednesday morning, the Houston Chronicle, to read the headline on the front page of the Houston Chronicle: "Controversial lesson plan nears okay in Houston education teaching." The state board clears the path for approving curriculum in Christian teaching. I'm curious. What do you think they mean, Christian teaching? Would it be in line with what I've done? No? I'm just curious. I was sitting in meditation a few days ago while working on this, by the way, and I kept thinking, I wish there was someone that I could talk to who could give me information about where we are culturally. And I know you're supposed to focus on your breath or Jesus or Mary or something when you meditate, but what came to my mind was this guy, John Meacham. John Meacham is a presidential historian. I think he has a good reputation. He's a good man. He's at Vanderbilt. And I thought, I wonder what John Meacham would say about where we are. So I called him up. I didn't. I just pulling your leg. I did a search and I found out that he had done an interview on Firing Line. And the subtitle about the show was "What Trump's Reelection Means for the Soul of the Nation." And it's a very fair evaluation. Now, I tell you what, you can go home and you can look this up on YouTube, but knowing that you might have the memory span that I do, I will put the YouTube link in the summary that goes out about this class, as well as I did your homework for you. I went online, I got the transcript of this talk, and I created it in a PDF. I'll put that on the website as well. It's copyrighted material by PBS, so treat it as such. A couple of things that John Meacham said stood out for me. One was, we must be very clear-eyed and sober-minded about the risk that institutions won't constrain Donald Trump this time. And then he went on to talk about that from a historical perspective. Some felt comforting and some felt terrifying, and you can read it or listen to it yourself and see. And then at the end of the interview, the woman who is doing the interviewing said to him, "Do you have one last thought to contribute to our time today?" And he said, "I can't underscore enough how I would like us in 4 years to look back and say that I was proved wrong." We are at sea. Now, what can we do? So with the story of Jesus walking on the stormy water in one hand and the newspaper, whatever that is, in the other, I want to make 4 suggestions. Oh, God. You could write the rest of this yourself. The first has to do with being patient and persistent and having a spiritual practice. Look, I'm going to keep ranting about this because it is so important. When the atomic bomb was first used and the world was terrified, Carl Jung was asked, "Do you think we will make it?" And Carl Jung said, "If enough people do their personal work." He had you in mind when he said that, and me. Ain't nobody else going to do it. So, doing the spiritual practice is not easy. In fact, if you find it easy, I got some questions about what you're doing. A pianist does not expect etudes to be easy. Not if they really want to play. Now, in having a spiritual practice that includes getting some new information in your head, one of the hardest things, especially for Christians in this part of the country, is going to be to unlearn. And that's when I get the line, "You didn't leave me with anything to hold on to." That's the point of the story, is that you're not held. I mean, you don't hold. Sacred mystery does the holding. We get in the boat and ride it out. And if you stay with it long enough of this unlearning, then you get to unknow. You know, you get to where Meister Eckhart's prayer finally makes sense. "God, rid me of God." Oh, that's what that means. Ah. So we get in the boat, we head out thinking we're saving our hides, and we discover that we are in turbulent waters over our heads. We can't save ourselves, and we have to face up to the hard truth that much of the turmoil we are experiencing is turmoil we created. Taking personal responsibility is not a thing that most Americans do well. Now, those of you who have actually tried a meditation practice know the turbulence in your mind. Meditation doesn't create it, it just reveals it. It's already there. So if I get up at 5:30 and I'm sitting and I'm thinking, okay, now who do I see at 3 o'clock today? Oh, God, I've done this for so long. I wonder if it's doing me any good. I don't feel any growth. When's the timer going off? Oh my God, only 4 minutes? Oh, did you hear what was on CNN the other day? Oh my God. All right, get that out of my mind. And then you think about something that you've done to somebody, or more likely something that somebody's done to you that offends you. We're at sea. That's the first thing. Just acknowledging that. And then saying, okay, I'll get in the boat. Which means that we have to keep looking at Jesus. Which means that we have to keep, no matter what, practicing kindness, compassion, and justice, no matter what. Those practices are not contingent on how you feel or what your circumstances are. There's another story about Jesus walking on the water, and Peter is in the boat, and he says, hey, that looks cool. I'd like to do that. If you get me to come to you, I'll walk on water too. I'll be a miracle man. And Jesus says, come on. And so Peter gets out of the boat and starts walking and looks down and says, oh, God. And starts to sink. That's where the phrase petering out comes from, by the way. I'm serious. That is it. That is it. It's a God's truth. We peter out when we quit looking at Jesus. And by looking at Jesus, I'm talking about, if it's helpful to have an icon, do it. But I'm talking about looking to Jesus means embodying, committing to practice to love, kindness, compassion, whatever. And it's hard. Which leads to the third thing, and that is an acknowledgement that we're all in the same boat. Everybody. There's so much hatred on both sides of the divide that exists in this country. And it's amazing to me that very, 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 very conservative, right-leaning Christian people hate people on the other side and vice versa. Is hatred part of the Christian tradition? I don't think so. Jesus didn't have a creed, but he followed a law which said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, strength, soul, and body, and love your neighbor as yourself. If you got any question about that, read the parable of the Good Samaritan, who was neighbor to the man who fell in need. And fourth, we're called to embrace the faith that everything is going to be okay. That doesn't mean it's going to turn out like you want it to. Things are not going to be like they were. The mystery that is at the heart of the faith in the way of Jesus. And by the way, this is not my notes, but we're talking this way because of our culture and tradition. If we were somewhere else, we wouldn't. But this is the well that we have chosen to dig 60 feet deep in the Christian tradition. It's no claim that this is the best or the only. It's just our tradition. And the mystery at the heart of the Christian tradition is that death does not have the last word. There is death. It just doesn't win. So if you want hope, embrace resurrection. Go from this place today and live resurrected lives. No matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, remember this, you carry precious cargoes, so watch your step, and see you here next week.